even though it's not anything about their fault from how they produce the coffee. So this is something that I wanted to address and change and use some of the skills that we developed over the time that I've had in coffee to try and make it easier and also more accessible. So just go to the next one. So things that I asked in this kind of question of this journey is, are we focusing too much emphasis on the Western market? Are we creating accessible tools? And how do we get the knowledge and necessary skills down to anyone who purchases a machine? I found that there was four key problems that we needed to address when developing and creating the Link project. The main one that I wanted to do is accessibility. The thing that frustrated me in coffee and with roasting is it there's so many great machines on the market. When I was looking at what was available, you have such a plentiful abundance of choice. But it doesn't matter how much you spend on a roaster or how good it is in its functionality, it still doesn't allow you to have the skill set in order to operate it correctly. So I wanted to find a way in which we could systemize roasting that regardless of skill set, whether you're new to roasting or you have a lot of experience in roasting, that you could jump in and through a system that was practical, have the ability to roast your samples regardless of your knowledge. The second big thing that I wanted to target was affordability. So most of the time, a great piece of equipment does cost quite a lot of money. In some of the areas that need sample roasting, it simply was not affordable. So the idea was they would either go to a cooperative or a roast master where they'd have to collectively wait for their samples to be produced, or they would have to turn to alternate methods which were simply not representing their coffee in a correct way. The third main thing was practicality. Things that I wanted to look at and address was how do we look to challenge and question some of the obstacles in roasting. So there's been a lot of progression, but I'm not sure if anyone in this group would agree with me. But there also felt to be a little bit of a plateau that some of the aspects of coffee roasting, some of the challenges, some of the things which make day-to-day production or sampling a little difficult were almost just accepted as this is the reality of coffee roasting. They won't change. So I wanted to question, can we ask and dive into aspects and see can they be done better? And the last part of Link project and problems that I saw that I wanted to address was simply education. I find that myself, I've been blessed with quite a good coffee career. I've been roasting for 15 years. I would say I roasted terrible coffee for 7 of those 15 years, but by learning and having the chance to make a mistake, I could understand the outcome and guide my direction a little bit better when it came to preparing roasts and understanding how to work with different coffees. What I wanted to do with this project is I've always been, as I said, so thankful for my career that if I can leave the industry in a better place than it started through allowing people to understand roasting a little bit better, then I'll be happy and sleep better at night. And this is why we love doing these webinars because it's a great chance to just talk through ideas and concepts and how we see roasting. I will say that some of the theories and concepts we present to you today are our understanding of how we work with coffee. The beautiful thing about coffee is there's not one right way that you can approach it. It's all about how you construct the puzzle pieces of the different variables together in order to get that outcome. And some of the things that would hopefully allow you to see as we progress and do more of these classes is how you yourself can manipulate all of those little variables in order to get a more successful outcome. So this is the roadmap of the link. We focused originally on targeting the traveler, buyer, coffee buyer, producers at origin. And then we've really started to evolve where the link system can be. You're seeing it now with home enthusiasts. You're seeing it with independent cafes doing cafe service roast to order. We had a fantastic event in Sydney a few days ago where we showed the concept that roasting is now something that doesn't need to happen back of house a few days in advance before you can serve it. It can actually be something where you can prepare coffee to order and manage your not only your cost of goods a little bit better, but also give the customer a experience and insight that allows them more appreciation of coffee. And another big focus for us was working on the competitor, the person who spends a lot of money on coffee, wants to get the best expression, and how do we allow the roaster to deliver the quality that they're looking for in the system. So when we were developing this project, the first thing that we wanted to see was, can it produce quality? And the best test that we had was, we need to take this roaster to the World Barista Championships or Brewers Cup and get some feedback. Throughout my career, how we've developed our um, understanding of coffee is using those competitions as a great feedback tool. And that allows you to shape and refine the way in which you prepare your coffees. In 2021, we'd finally got the prototype ready for Link, and we started preparing those coffees. We worked with two independent baristas, and surprisingly, we had a fantastic result. So we knew that we could develop the quality that we want out of the roaster, but the idea was, how do we allow people to utilize it in the same way that I do? Going back a little bit, a lot of you will see the roaster as, well, there's the Cafe Logic Nano and the Link. How does this relationship work? When I was moving away from being in a fixed roastery, I was looking for an alternate. I connected with a gentleman who's in this call, Wayne, through a mutual friend, and he sent me a sample of the original Nano. And this is a fantastic bit of equipment, and you'll notice that we share pretty much the same hardware for the Link project. What I also understood in this is that was designed for a particular purpose in a particular market, and it does that function really well. But when we want to apply the uses and some of the aspects to a more commercial setting, for sampling, for coffee buying, for competitions, there's features and aspects that a professional or more someone in the coffee industry would want certain features in order to be able to control it a little bit better. So we came with the team with a pitch in order to develop a concept that we would take that existing hardware and look to evolve and build on it in order to give the functionality, the quality, and the controls that someone who is using it in their everyday, more professional coffee setting would like to be able to get the outcomes that they want. I want to run you guys through a little bit of the core operation of the Link in order to make it a little bit clearer to how it works, how we've designed it, and also some of the key aspects that make it quite unique. So the first thing is providing the tools to known obstacles. So one of the things that I first wanted to challenge and we wanted to work on is understanding what is portability and how do we address it. And that's focusing on what we call the altitude calibration. So something that I noticed is there are other roasters on the market that you can pack them in your suitcase, you can take them to a new location, you can plug them in and you can start roasting. And to most people, they're very happy with that degree of portability. The frustration that I had is working with high level competitors for around 8 years. We would travel to a new country. We would have spent 4, 5, 6 months developing a particular profile for that roaster, for that competitor, sorry. They would get to that country, plug in the roaster, start roasting, and then because of the environmental conditions, all of that profiling work that we'd done basically went in the bin. The very hard thing to understand is roasting isn't so much about what's happening in the machine, but also the environmental factors of where you're roasting, especially when you have electricity, different altitude, different air densities, different moistures in the air will drastically affect the way in which a coffee will roast. And for me, I wanted to change that. If we want profile sharing and the ability for people to have a great system, we want to make sure that there is some degree of it being easier for the user to not have to worry and customize and edit profiles because they're simply moving location. I also wanted to open up a more honest feedback loop from someone who has purchased a coffee from a producer and a producer. And if they had the same machine and they were roasting the same sample, they would be able to actually see the same expression of the coffee. This led us to developing what we now call altitude calibration. So the way in which I thought about it is in the past, what we had done is we'd always adapted our roast profiles to where we took the roaster. And I was in a pretty headset mind of how about we do this in reverse? When we take our roaster to a different location, how about we adjust the calibration and the settings of the roaster so that when you plug it in and start roasting, internally what's happening in that chamber, it mimics and thinks that it's at the same environmental conditions or temperatures, or altitudes as when you started or developed that profile. This is a pretty long and arduous task. Developing the algorithm that would allow this calibration, I think, took me around 7 weeks, 5 different countries, 120 different farms, and I think we had 60 or 70 different elevations. We're also testing different power voltages and how that would affect. What we learned is there was a lot of impact on how you went up in altitude that would not only affect the movement of the coffee, but also the boiling point and cracking temperatures. And what we looked to standardize in the system was by setting a particular setting in the roaster, that the roaster itself would always think that it's roasting at sea level. And the great thing about this is if it always thinks it's roasting at sea level rather than if you're at, maybe Sydney here, I'm at 2 or 20 meters above sea level. I've roasted in Bolivia at 4,000 meters. I've roasted in Guatemala City at 1,500 meters and largely used the exact same profiles that's recommended by the system. And this is fantastic because it gives you ease of use and that true sharing. And I think it's one of those nice things that you don't need to consistently do every day. Once you get a new link, you pop in your meters above sea level on the side, tells you your setting, and it will save and be remembered until you take it to a new location. The next aspect of knowing obstacles is even if we develop a profiling system which will allow the user to find a profile and get a recommendation, I am very aware that sometimes it cannot go exactly correct. And we didn't want to just have a system that recommended profile and when it wasn't to the user's taste or it didn't roast correctly in the system, that it would not be able to be corrected fast, which is why we developed the advanced dial-in function. This one is a feature that I think a lot of people don't quite realize. But when you go through some of the profiling attributes, which I will later on, you'll see why it's such an important tool in developing a more successful roast from that initial roast that you've done. But this tool is essentially to guide you that if you're using a particular coffee, it's selected a roast plan, a power curve, you've roasted it, and a first crack has occurred at a particular time. The only data point that we haven't collected prior to roasting is that exact first crack. We have a pretty good estimate based on our data and how we've driven the link of where that coffee will crack, what temperature that coffee will crack. But some coffees, just because of process or how they are, sit outside of the standard data range that we do have. The nice thing about this feature is you can simply select the roast plan that you've used, enter the true cracking time and the profile that you utilize, and it will give you a recommendation of if you want a optimized roast that's going to successfully hit all of the percentages of dry, Maillard, and development phase correctly, I would recommend using this setting. So essentially in two roasts, your first roast and your second roast, you'll have a perfect dial in. The next aspect is now getting into the profiling system. So what I wanted to do is make those complex decisions of deciding how should I roast this coffee a lot easier? I'm not sure if there's any coffee roasters in this call, but I think one of the frustrations I started to have is as coffee progressed, as processing progressed, the predictability about how we approach coffee started to really become quite difficult. When you only get 100 grams of coffee and you're trying to make a executive buying decision that could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, you kind of want to have a pretty good understanding that the sample you have roasted is a fair and honest expression of that coffee. And one thing I started to notice is just as processing evolved, people were playing with fermentations, that the standardized use of altitude, variety, country, where we could maybe dictate some patterns, started to go out the door. There was wash coffees roasting like naturals, naturals roasting like wash, anaerobics coming in, just messing up everything and giving us a very crazy expression of how we prepare coffee. And I wanted something a little bit easier. I wanted to take subjectivity out of the preparation process and focus more on something which was non-biased, which is data and numbers. So we look to collect um, a whole bunch of information to develop the profiling system. I think I started with around 5 to 6 thousand different individual independent roasts. We collected everything from humidity, volume by weight density, process, country, altitude, variety, region it was growing at, water activity, you name it. We collected every data point about a coffee before we roasted it, and then logged everything about how that coffee roasted, which profile worked, why it worked, what power curve we used, what profile style I'd used as a base in order to find a pattern and tendencies. We noticed that as we extracted all of the successful roasts, there was a general pattern around four key variables that would impact a roast that would allow me to create an algorithm that would become the link profiling system. This algorithm with simple inputs is able to guide you for the purpose of use to a very easy starting point. That then from there you can choose to load that, roast it as is, or make some small adjustments shall you wish. And the nice thing about this is it takes the guesswork of how is this coffee going to behave. One thing which is really important to note is even if you have the same coffee farm, the same altitude, the same variety, and the same process, and you have several lots from that particular producer, even the roast approach, which is going to be optimized for that, can vary. And going through the link system, that really told us a lot about how those variations occurs and maybe why sometimes when we cup a table of 10 coffees, seven of them are fantastic and three of them are over under, and we don't know why because we've prepared them in the exact same way. So the way in which the system works is it isolates first out the roast style. So the link system has four styles of roast: cupping, omni, filter, and espresso. This is the base kind of parameter that it will need in order to make a decision on which of the roast blends are going to be best suited for the intended use that you have. The next thing that we look at is the roast plan. So this is where a lot of people get confused about how the system works. And why I wanted to do this is it breaks it down in a little bit more of a simple context. So currently, the operating system that is commercially available is the ADAS 4.1. The thing that I want you to take away here is that in ADAS 4.1, although it seems like there is a lot of roast profiles, there's only 18 roast plans. Now, these are the master plans or the master design of how we've created the roast profile that we base into the different roast styles. You can see that we have 5 master plans that are titled A, B, C, D, E within cupping. We have 6 in the filter, 6 in espresso, and for now, just 1 in the Omni. So the way in which it works is we select our roast style. Let's say we're selecting filter, and then we have the option with the algorithm to either select the roast plan for us, or we can do a manual selection, which I'll get into a little bit later on. But it's deviated out into those nice clear structures. When it comes to the different plans, they all have different attributes that we're trying to achieve out of the roast plan in order to have a more successful roast for the intended use. The algorithm is designed to be smart that it can look at uh, that particular qualities or tendencies of those coffees that we know within the data we're collecting, and recommend a approach which is better suited to that particular coffee. You'll see that generally speaking, if you're using the new sample entry, majority of the cupping selections will be from A, B, and D. And I would say that 60 to 70% of the selections will be from the D 12%, because as a standardized cupping profile, it's the best all-round approach that we found for majority of coffee samples. We have applied a few extra roast profiles that we developed for cupping, which is the C18 and the E20. These ones have been essentially designed for certain markets who like to cup more developed styles of coffees, that they found that these plants were not maybe suited to their particular outcome and taste. What we notice with the different plans is in cupping, because we have a standardized preparation method, we have a understanding globally that cupping is a certain micron grind. We brew at a certain temperature, and we use a certain amount of time to steep that particular coffee, that we can have a more standardized approach that all of the profiles, regardless of when we had first crack, regardless of how much development percent, and the preheat, have a exactly the same or very similar termination target point for the roast profile. You'll see in the note that we have different amounts of rate of rises applied throughout the different roasts, that even though this one has a softer approach through the dry phase and a shorter Maillard, we built up the development in the development phase. We spend longer, which gives it balance and structure. The really great thing about the link system is the manual profile selection mode allows you to get a power curve recommendation for any of these profiles. I would suggest that you can try the initial recommended new sample entry approach, but if you do want to go into something a little bit more tailored to your taste, that take one coffee, roast it on all 5 approaches using the manual selection mode, which will give different power curve recommendations for the same coffee based on the volume by weight density in the process. Roast it all, cup them, and then see if there's a particular tendency that you notice. The system is designed to be very easy if you want to use it in autopilot, where it recommends everything for you, or you can go manually and make that selection that you might know. For Brazils, for example, I always roast my Brazils on the B15, which I manually select, even if the data is showing me, okay, this has this density, this process, because I currently am not putting country into the current version of the algorithm, though that will maybe come down the path, that it's selecting maybe the D profile. But the nice thing about this, because I've cupped it, I've understand the tendencies of what I like. I know that, you know what, for this coffee, I want to try this one because I do know it's going to mitigate a little bit more of that earthiness, it gives me more sweetness and balance. And the fun thing is you get to try and see what works for your taste when it comes to developing the cupping protocols for your um, farm, for your roastery, or just if you're, an enthusiast getting coffees and you want to see different expressions. A really cool thing that we did recently on the cupping plans is we curated all of the um, private auction lots for doTERRA for their masterpiece. What we realized is the coffees were so complex, I could have cupping profiles that express different characteristics. I could create a cupping profile that focused more on the variety, the terroir, or I could create a cupping profile that showed more of the process and the body and sweetness and fruity characteristics of the profile. So instead of just selecting one, we gave out with that private auction sample box a option for the user to see the different expressions and personalities of each lot through different profiles that would give a successful outcome, but just express different characteristics. And the thing to understand with all these plans is they're designed regardless of your preference, to give a successful outcome, even though there's a completely different style of characteristics that might be brought out by each. We move on and we can have a look at the filter profiles. So the filter profiles get a little bit more interesting. What you see is there's more deviation in the roast time. There's more deviation in the plans when it comes to the development through dry phase, Maillard phase, and also the development setting. Big one for me is focusing on what I like to call temperature by time increase, which is kind of a way to have a look at, okay, we've maybe spent for these profiles where you see the E, B, and D, more time in Maillard phase. But in order to give a balance that we can still do a nice development on that coffee and not have it tasting too heavy, too harsh, or unpleasant, that we can do a very low increase after the point of first crack. I put something out recently to someone who asked me about link. They were like, it's very strange because everything I've ever been taught in roasting is that there's a certain increase that you need after first crack and a certain amount of time. Anything below that time is underdeveloped. And as I said, part of this project is to question the status quo of what is roasting and how do you develop qualities. I think something that needs to be understood is development isn't just one aspect or development percentage. It's how you piece together the entire pieces of the puzzle of that profile in terms of power, curve, in terms of the preheat, in terms of the amount of time in dry phase, the amount of time in Maillard phase, the increases in points of when you fasten up the rate of rise and slower it, that all combine to create a successful roast. So I would say that even if you're maybe used to a particular, okay, we always increase our coffees at 6 degrees or 30% or whatever you may do, it's understanding about what happens also prior first crack that has the biggest impact on why the end stage has been set up the way it has. And that will maybe allow you to see why this coffee has been set the way, in the profile. Something to understand is even what we have with these defaults is they're default curves for a reason. Once you've loaded them, once you've put them on the system, you can simply adjust the DTR or the development percentage up or down. Or if you really want, you can jump into the studio and start to edit the profile to your desired characteristics from that starting point. The idea is it gives you a starting point in order to build off and get you further along the dial-in process so you're not wasting several roasts just to understand the tendencies of how that coffee might behave. Espresso profiles, a little bit more interesting. So for me, espresso is very personal. Filter coffee, because of the concentration and how we prepare it, I find that we can be a little bit more recommending on which profile plan might suit. But for espresso, for me, I find it's very much around the preparation. Something that I've always, developed for my approach in coffee and throughout my coffee career, working with a lot of competitors, is that we roast to a concentration. And what that means is that we start backwards with all of our process. That if we have an intended extraction, an intended recipe, an intended dose, that we are looking to prepare the coffee in, let's prepare the roast profile to that particular style over doing a roast and then figuring out the recipe after. I think that that largely goes across all of the other roast styles as well. And if you are in competition and listening to this conversation, generally, if you are asking for a recommendation from Jerome or myself on which profiles, we'll generally ask you how you're preparing your coffee and then give you the recommendation on where we would set certain DTR percentages, certain profile plans based on that. But moving back to espresso, I already know from the recommended base setting that we need to incorporate the concentration right from the beginning. So we ask a question, and the first pop-up is, how do you like your coffee? Do you want something more vibrant, lively, and soft, or do you want something that has more depth, balance, and texture? Depending on that first question, the profiling system knows, does it select from the lower and longer power curves, which we see in the D, E, and F, or is it going to go something that has a much higher increase at the start, but then we generally rely on a higher development percentage in order to balance out that expression. And we know that they're the more modern and progressive style of coffees that have those longer brew ratios, the 1 to 3s, the 1 to 3.5s. They're vibrant, they're fun, they're easy to drink. Maybe they don't score great on the WBC score sheet because they lack the texture and tactile balance, but they're really enjoyable coffees to maybe suit our taste because we don't want that weight, that texture, that creaminess. Again, we focus on that time to increase ratio, and that's very important for me. That is that constant balance depending on how much time you spend post crack and how much increase that you have. And a lot of people think too much, or in my opinion, focus so much on the increase in the development percentage. And as I said, going back, it really depends what we're doing through these stages here, which is going to give us the combination that we need to be to how we can set the profiles in terms of development. We're working on something really new and fun when it comes to the Omni space, and we've actually got a profile that'll allow you to do a 15-minute or 16-minute filter approach. And the focus is a really low development range through the bottom, stretching out the Maillard, but doing a super low time increase ratio of only around 1 degree for around 3 or 5% development. And you'd be surprised because people always assume through status quo that a cupping profile, a filter profile are faster roasts. And generally, yes, they are when we approach it in a typical sense. But when you look outside the box and you think about the combinations, it doesn't really need to be that if you've managed the parameters a little bit different. And our idea with the link system is to give an abundance of options for people to play with and really start to challenge and find the style of roast that they want to work with. Moving on to the Omni, 4.1 Addis only has the one profile to work on. The idea behind the Omni profile is that you really adapt just the DTR or the development percentage based on the intended purpose of use. But this is maybe a really nice one that maybe a home user only buys one coffee. They have that coffee for the next maybe 2 or 3 months, but they prepare that coffee in several different ways that they want to explore an option for filter, Omni, or espresso, and they can play around with the development percentages that they may find will give them a more positive expression to their own individual taste. So that's how the profile plans work. The most important thing is then, okay, I have a Brazil coffee, I have a Kenyan coffee. We all know that these coffees roast differently. How do you use a master plan and have that go across different coffees with different characteristics? And this is where the power curve numbers come in. So I'm going to use an analogy. Jerome's probably going to roll his eyes, but I always find that that's the easiest way to understand things is let's say we select this master plan. We've selected filter C, and that's the coffee plan that has been selected for this coffee to be prepared on. I want to say that a best idea of what that would be is like me and Jerome going into a sneaker shop. We might both want a pair of Nike shoes, but I know already Jerome has a much bigger foot than me, but we want to wear the same shoes because we want to look like twinsies. So in order for him to wear the same style of shoe as me, he needs a larger shoe size. And for me, with my tiny little feet, I need a smaller shoe size. It's very much the same way in which the profile plans work. So if we select this profile plan and we have a coffee like a Wash Kenyan, I know a Wash Kenyan needs a softer heat soak throughout the roasting approach. It needs a softer application of heat, and tendency wise, it generally has a earlier first crack. In order for that coffee to use this plan, I would need a lower power curve number to make sure that all of the timings between dry phase, Maillard phase, and the development come closer into line for the intended time phase of that original master plan. Moving on the opposite side for a Brazil coffee, we know that that has a lower general organic density concentration. Because of it being natural, it also needs more heat in order to have first crack at a particular time. Because we're really targeting when we want that first crack, we need to adapt the profile and heat applied throughout in order to make sure that the dry phase, Maillard phase, and when we have that first crack is actually hitting that master plan. The system's designed to recognize the data points you put in and make a suggestion on which plan is best going to suit that style of coffee. And then once you have that plan, it'll then recommend which power curve is needed to be used in order for everything to work. You can watch this quickly if you want. This is just for you to understand that, let's say we've taken that filter C. This is a video of me duplicating over 50 to sometimes 60 times the same power curve in order to make sure that we have enough of a concentration that there is a solution for every coffee. The rules of standard deviation would say that most of the profiles will sit in this band of the coffee, of the power curve numbers, but occasionally you have the outlying coffees that we continue to duplicate until we have a power curve number suggestion suitable for any coffee that we've encountered for the link system. If we have a coffee that for whatever reason does not have a correct power setting, we will duplicate and update the power curve or the profile pack in order to have that solution available for the user. Let's go into a quick way of unpacking all of that and showing you how easy it is. Because I know for some people are like, wow, that's a lot of information. That's a lot of numbers. I'm just new to coffee and that's a little bit scary. It's crazy simple. So essentially, we would select a new sample entry or a manual profile selection. New sample entry will dictate for you the the profile plan and the power curve, where if we do a manual profile selection, it allows us to select the particular profile plan we want a recommendation for, and then it'll give us the recommended outputs to that particular plan that we've selected. So we make the first selection of what we're looking for. We select the roast style. We put in our two variables, which are essential, which is volume by weight, density, and process. We can add the variety. It does make a small adjustment to specific varieties, but it's not completely necessary. What I realized in the data collection is there's only certain varieties that need a deviation away from the standard. So having the users having to enter variety every time made more time, and maybe if it wasn't showing that it was giving a different result for them, maybe a small frustration, which is why we made it optional. There is plans in the future to ask for more optional data, which will give you a closer recommendation. For example, I mentioned for cupping, if I was roasting Brazil, personally, I know that I would select a B15% profile because I know it's going to articulate the qualities better. That will also be integrated into the new sample entry moving forward in order to allow people to make those smart decisions who maybe don't understand the system. Let's do a little recap before we move into some of the unique features. So essentially, the way in which it works is our data points in. We select our roast style, we put in our volume by weight density, process of the coffee. If we have some of the more advanced settings put up into the system, we can also implement the screen size of the coffee and then have the variety and batch size. Why the screen size is important is it allows us to utilize the fan adjust setting in order to make an adjustment away from the default setting specifically for that roast. If we know that coffee is either very dense or very large, and the algorithm will adjust for which recommended setting it would start on. The nice thing about that is it completes the roast and then goes back to factory calibration. The great thing about this is we find that, especially for people wanting to use the link, it allows them to roast a myriad of different coffees, different densities, different sizes, and have it adjusted for them so that the movement, which I will cover in a few slides later on, is super important that it's correctly moving. So data points in, and then what it will give us is data points out. So it will select the roast plan, the power curve, give us information that if it is a profile that we should adjust the development percent, what range we would typically work in. The fan adjust, which I mentioned, was that setting at the start of the roast that we can alter away from the base setting, and then also an estimated first crack time. I think a lot of you have seen this, but just if you haven't, we can just run through running through that particular process so that you get a quick understanding. So we're going to select for this one, I believe, new sample entry. This is set up to select the screen size. Again, wording, small, medium, large, standard, or you can go by a particular screen size. We select the roast style that we want, which is filter. Then we will go in, enter the volume by weight density, which is done by the density tube. Select the process of the coffee. When we select the process, it doesn't need to be the exact process of the coffee, just what best represents this particular coffee. So you might have an 82-hour anaerobic or aerobic or nitrogen. That one you would select anaerobic natural because it's the most suited to what that coffee style is. Most of the algorithms working on the volume by weight density. If you have advanced roast details, it'll also ask the batch size. Why that is important is when you have a larger amount of coffee in the roast chamber, you have more bean-to-bean contact. That bean-to-bean contact naturally transfers heat between the coffee beans and moves the roast forward, which means that we may need a lower power curve number for a larger batch size of the same coffee. But in order to have the same result when we're roasting smaller amounts, we may need to increase the power curve to compensate for the fact that there's less bean-to-bean contact, which means we need to rely more on the applied heat from the heating mechanism rather than going from the beans that are touching and naturally conducting the heat. So as you see, there's little details and steps throughout the way in which we've designed the system that you don't even know exactly all of the things that it's figuring out, but all of those little questions and attributes are designed to get you closer to a more successful roast and factor in how you're using it. The nice thing about the Link and all Cafe Logic manufactured machines is we have that variable batch size. We're not fixed at one, batch size that it's a 50 or 100-gram roaster. You can roast whatever you want in there, and depending on what you put in there, the machine will naturally adapt to the fan setting, the heating setting that's needed for a smaller batch size. We take that one step further with the Link that we also adapt that even though it will adapt to give you a successful power gradient, we know there was a small deviation when it did down power that needed to be corrected, and we corrected that through the solution process in order to give you a more fair expression of which power curve will get you closer to that perfect roast from your first roast. Let's jump into some of the unique features. So these are attributes of Link, which and some of them also other Cafe Logic machines that make this quite a unique roaster on the market. The first one is that ambient temperature start. So a lot of people are completely freaked out by this particular feature, but it makes a lot of sense once I break it down and mention to you. I think that for me, this feature is one of the I just always glaze over it. I don't really get, too impressed by it, but so many people like mind blowing because it's just so different to what they expect. So the way in which the Link works is we essentially start it at room temperature. The machine has a ambient temperature sensor that will read the environment of the room and know what it needs to adapt based on any retained heat in the machine, or if a room is hotter or colder in terms of the preheat. It will run the preheat stage up until about 45 seconds and then come back onto the profile. A lot of people have asked why this feature and why does this work. I think the first thing to understand is when we go right back to some of the problems and solutions that we were looking to create through this roaster, one of them was about practicality. One thing for me is when I was sample roasting and I had, 40 samples to do in a day, every time I preheat a batch before dropping my sample, it can add 2-3 minutes in my day, which means that those 40 roasts, which could take me an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever the time is, might take me 5 hours to roast because I'm spending so much time preheating my roaster. The question that we wanted to ask is, can we do it better? Can we do it more efficient? Why do we preheat? So if you ask about preheating historically in roasting, that was the first question I wanted to start in. Back in the day, we had large masses of coffee because we were never sample roasting. They were, 10, 15, 20, 100 kilos of coffee. And we wanted to take them to temperatures, maybe 200, 250, whatever we're roasting to. It was physically impossible from a heat transfer perspective to convert enough energy into the roast in order to have a particular dedicated time and that conversion of heat occur over that dedicated time. By introducing a hot environment, dropping the cold coffee at room temperature into that environment and having it equalize at a turning point, it now meant that if we were sitting at 100 or 150 or whatever our turning point is degrees, we would only need to travel 100 degrees in 15 minutes, which was far more achievable for the machines that we had. Essentially, the Cafe Logic system does it in reverse, where we heat to a turning point. It goes through the preheating phase, we heat to the turning point. You'll see when it's hit the maximum point where it's going to come back on roast, you'll see this almost heat peak in the rate of rise line. And from there, we start the roasting process. It's exact same process, but slightly in reverse. The thing that we did not realize in this, and with particularly the link profiles that I was designing, is by utilizing this ambient temperature start and the profile curves that we were designing, we were creating a coffee that straight off roast had notably far less CO2 to our taste palettes that we could experience, which means that we could roast the coffee, cup, brew, even extract through espresso straight off roast. Which is one of the great benefits of this system is majority of the profiles will taste fantastic off roast. They do get better with age, and you'll see that even with the filters, because they don't have as much notable CO2 to our taste palette, it doesn't mean that that coffee now ages faster. A lot of the people using it for competition, cafes, etc., if they're not looking to do that unique roast to order service, they will actually age these coffees 5, 6 days for your filters, 2, 3 days for the cupping profiles, and 7 to 20 days for the espressos in order to get the best balance. A coffee will still have more time to develop its characteristics. The thing that I like to say about the link is you just have a larger window in order to enjoy your characteristics. One thing I want to touch on quickly before we move to some of the other features is we like to do a lot of studies with universities on coffee to understand them. A particular study that we were interested in doing was on when a coffee straight off roast has its most notable presence or highest concentration of aroma volatile compounds, which are the compounds in a coffee or chemical or proteins or enzymes that when we brew them and taste them, it gives us those reflections of particular flavor calls. One thing that we did in that study is we realized that straight off roast, the coffee had its highest concentrations with the data collected, 36 hours of aroma volatiles. But most of you would also notice that in 36 hours off roast, most roasters, in particular regular gas or other fluid bed roasters, it's also the time frame where we have the most abundance or concentration of CO2 sensory and also physically. And even though there is CO2 within the link roast, the way in which the CO2 is, I guess, developed in the roast, it doesn't have that harshness to it that we were able to access more of those aroma volatiles, which is why I do believe that the coffees taste so great. A little point to talk on here is you think about the mechanism and going back to this profile. When we talk about traditional roasting, the first thing that a coffee experiences is temperatures that are sometimes hotter than where we're taking that roast at the end of the profile in terms of the finish degree. That has a hugely detrimental impact on the coffee, in my opinion. That not only changes the chemical structure of the outer layer, where it rapidly shrinks that porous layer, which creates the trap and sealing in the CO2, but it also, what we've noticed tendency-wise, for the same development and same kind of increases, creates a greater loss in your coffee. If you measure a link roast out, you'll see that most of them only have between 12 to 13, maybe 14% loss. And if you're running a commercial roastery, you would know that generally you operate on somewhere of 15 to 20 or higher, depending on how you're approaching the coffee. And the only way I can say is because some of these coffees we do develop to 23, 24%. They might be 11, 12-minute roast, same time frame as espresso. It's not just the cupping roast, and we lose significantly less mass. And I think that that's largely due to the heating mechanism, the profile design, and the fact that it's less aggressive. It's more of a homogenization of heat transfer, that we have a coffee that is allowed to remain more porous throughout the roasting process, which it doesn't have those trapped harsh CO2s, but it also is a coffee that hasn't been heat shocked at the start of the roast, which allows a lot more of the organic material to not be damaged in the roasting process. Second unique aspect to the link is, and Cafe Logic machines, but we particularly go a little bit further with how we calibrate the link, is the movement of the coffee. So a lot of people will think, well, this is a fluid bed roaster, which is correct. It momentum is moved by hot air, by air, and its heating mechanism is hot air. But what we wanted to work on is a movement style that would give us development of qualities. As I mentioned, that the bean to bean contact is super important for me when it comes to transfer of heat. Prior to embarking on this project, my biggest issue that I've always had with fluid bed roasters is they have wonderful acidity, they have wonderful flavor articulation, fantastic expression of aromas. But what I often find they miss is they just don't capture the body sweetness and texture, and they have a hollowness, but also a volatility to the style of roast that they rapidly change very fast. And because of that, I generally always preferred gas roasted coffee. And I wanted to ask, well, why do I prefer gas roasted coffee? And to me, it wasn't so much the fact that the flame was driving the heating mechanism to the drum, but it was actually about the movement of the coffee. And when you think about a gas roasted coffee or a drum roasted coffee, the drum spins, it rises with the blades inside the machine, the coffee to the top of the roaster, and then that tumbling effect falls, kind of meshing and merging the coffee so that they're always tumbling and interacting with each other. That tumbling effect is allowing that heat transfer. So the link essentially and Cafe Logic are pulsating fluid beds where it has a movement that will circularly turn the coffee, but you'll also see an arrhythmic tumble that allows the coffee to mesh and kind of turn elliptical as well as horizontal. We spend a lot of time, and it's very frustration on the factory with the calibration point. We have a particular animator setting that for us, making sure that the altitude calibration is aligned and everything with the movement is so important on that calibration. We don't trust visual calibration, we trust data, we trust precision, and that by aligning that movement exactly, it allows us to then have a system that then can move very correctly for the density, for the style of coffee, for the altitude that we're roasting at, in order to make sure that that coffee movement allowed that hybridization that we wanted from capturing the acidity, the aroma, the flavors of fluid bed, but the sweetness, body, and texture of a gas roasted coffee. So what I love about the link profiles is, to me, they have the best of both worlds, the best of that gas roast and the best of that air roasted structure. Another unique feature, which is something new, is what we call AFA, or automated fan adjustments. This was released in the 4.1 update, and essentially it's a sequence of automated fan increases that happen automatically throughout the roast that can be triggered by time or by first crack. The thing to think about in roasting is when we are doing commercial roasts, one thing that we manage is we manage airflow, especially when it comes to the end of the roast, which is the circulation of new air into the roaster and the increased circulation of the old air, which may have the pollutants like smoke or whatever going outside of the roaster. One thing that the initial system didn't allow was it didn't allow us to adjust the airflow or the fan adjust throughout the roast. The link system works that air is circulated underneath the roaster, pushed through the stack, and then straight through the blades out the top of the chaff collector. What I wanted to work on is, how do I get some of that commercial viability that we might have people who want to work with manual airflow, which is why you can adjust the fan settings throughout the roast live. But then I also realized, because we're trying to make this more practical to a wider audience, a lot of people don't understand how to manage airflow. So Jerome and myself spent a lot of time coding in a automatic sequence of increases at specific times in every profile of the link in order to allow a sequence that while the roast is traveling, if you have it set up into time because you're not manually logging first crack, it knows when to create that sequence. And that sequence allows us to have a increased circulation of fresh air into the roaster and a increased circulation of the air with the pollutants outside. Why this is hugely beneficial is sometimes we might taste a roast and we think it tastes under, but it tastes over, which means that essentially we might want to develop that coffee more, but because we maybe have poor airflow or the style of roast is a large batch size, that we've had some of that pollutant still sitting in the air that's kind of seeped into the coffee. Coffee absorbs what's around it, so it can absorb some of those qualities if we're not having the correct circulation. The nice thing about AFA is it allows us to have more soluble coffee that's super clean, but also sweeter, more developed, more round, if we want to go down that path because we have that control of how it can work. I'll give you a little example of what it looks like because you can see the fan steps live. This is super quick, but if you see the roast, you'll see these steps stepping up throughout the roast profile. On the back end, what that's doing is you can see automatically just increasing where it needs to go at those different settings in order to have a higher volume of air traveling through the bed and out the exhaust at those particular times. Those features alone make a huge difference to the taste. And I would say that by implementing that system from the Addis, 4 or even the Calca version 3, it's drastically improved the quality of the coffee that you can roast on the link. Last feature that I want to talk about before we talk about Marv is the zones. So another thing which I noticed is the system we created is a predictive system, which means we have a set outcome. We have a particular development percent increase and time that we're working on. The program that Chris has created is very smart, where it has ability to read what's happening in the rate of rise line and adapt of when it's going to go into a crash, stall, and flick, and go into an automated program where it runs the rate of rise minimum. A simple solution for that would be, okay, that's great. So when it needs to do that, let's just run it at the absolute lowest setting. But the issue that I found with that is by running it at the lowest setting, it was very detrimental to the precision that you would have prior to the point of first crack. And you'd only ever really have the ROR line going into negative or wanting to do weird stuff after the point of first crack. So what we worked on is a way that we could have the best of both worlds by having a zone system coded into all of the profiles that can also be triggered by first crack or by time. Why I mentioned by first crack is, let's say a first crack is slightly earlier or later than a default setting. Regardless of where that first crack is, the system is designed to adapt and amend the profile live so that even if it's slightly off where the profile should go, everything is matching the timing in order to give you a successful roast, even when things are slightly different. The nice thing about this is how we manage the zones is, let's say we're hitting a crash, it's a wash canyon, it's cracked, and we have a rapid heat dump. It runs the activation system, which is running the minimum rate of rise. I've got that set maybe at 3.5 because I want stability in the profile, but we still know based on the Scott-Rayo theory that we always want the rate of rise to constantly be declining. And we also don't want that overshoot that we are seeing the temperature increase drastically away from the default curve because we have the coffee running on a system automated. So what we would look to do is we have these settings where it starts to minus away the particular coffees, the amounts from the minimum. What you'll notice is it adds super precision that we get closer and closer to a perfect roast, and it doesn't deviate away from that default. You can see it manages it almost like autopilot coming into land. The best way I like to think about it is it's, yellow, orange, and red like a traffic light to bring it more tight so that we can have a more successful roast. Last little feature is Marv. So Marv is a automated chatbot that's essentially my brain done in AI by Jordan. If you have any questions, anything that you want to know, or you just want to ask roast theory in general, Marv is a perfect way for you to have an assistant with you all of the time. The nice thing about this is people are in different time zones. Someone might not have a chance to get out to you from 8 ounce or whatever. The great thing about that is you can ask it any questions about what's happening in 95 different languages, and he's going to give you a perfect response that's pretty well educated. You can even learn a lot about it. So Marv's accessible through the virtual assistant side. You can ask it the different questions, and it's going to give you the answers. This is an example of me asking it in Japanese. Last part before we jump onto some questions is where we see Link going. So my whole goal is, and this is why you see the same hardware used as the Nano, is I want to evolve digitally, not physically. And my goal is to have a product that while the user owns it, it only gets better. More features come out, better roasting precision, better control, more profiles. And it's really a product that's designed to be pro user rather than pro consumerism. That we want a product that, regardless of where you've got when you've joined the journey, you are able to run the exact same updated version that everyone else is enjoying. We don't want the Apple model where you need to buy the version, 15 because you've got the 13 and you can't run a particular function. We want to add the value, and this all becomes part of the affordability that if someone's spending 2/3 of their livelihood in a developing country on this roaster, we want to respect that. We want to make sure they get longevity out of this roaster. So how we do that is we create what we call operating systems. Right now we're on Addis and we've done a correction, which is the 4.1. You can see the previous versions there. The nice thing about it is if you don't like a particular feature or attribute, you can revert back to an old setting and run the profiles by going into the system and going there. But the nice thing about this is we've already got version 5, maybe version 6, and we will continue to progress and push the link until we've maximized all of the evolution, all of the controls, everything that we want. And the great thing about that is, unless it can be plugged into the roaster or adapted onto it, it's always going to be digitally. It's always going to be free. There's no subscriptions, no ongoing costs. Once you've bought it, you get that constant progression. We also have a lot of training videos that allow you to understand everything about the roaster. If you want to go into more specifics, you can use that as self-learning as well. Little finish up on the wrap is just a nice little nostalgic look. Is I remember starting this, and thank God I didn't go with this all off mustard yellow. But we need to start small, and it's nice to see the progression of where we can go. And I can guarantee you the version of the link that you are now using, now seeing within 6 months, 8 months, 2 years is going to drastically evolve and continue to progress, that you get value out of this system. You can see that already we're adding so many new features, info tabs to make it easier to use. We also listen to feedback. So if a user has a particular frustration when we do these updates, we look to amend to make it more practical and more simple to you guys and your feedback. What works for you? Because essentially, it doesn't matter how you want to prepare coffee. We want to create a way that you can use the link in order to get the outcome that you want. We don't want to dictate that you have to adapt what you want roast wise to suit our particular system. You can see already huge amounts of improvements in how we process the data and what we can give you in terms of details. When we get onto version 5 that we're working on, I think everyone's going to just be over the moon with the amount of precision details and what we can give you with some of the future development that we're already very far down the track with. Little summary, and this is a nice one for Wayne who's in the group, is I remember in 2020, just making live roasting on a nano system was quite a milestone and achievement. But, 2024, seeing what we can do with the same hardware, but just an ambitious team, a drive to improve, and a willingness to continue to push and question, we can do so much, and there's so much more that's still able to be done. And that's my presentation, guys. I'll jump it off to some questions. Hopefully that was an interesting little insight to the link.
Thank you everyone for attending this session as well. I want to thank 8 Ounce for helping us push this as well. I just wanted to take this time out. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat group as well. The first question actually, Sam, is does the Link app take data in for you to update the profiles?
So at the stage, there's a back end. We don't use any of the data. Essentially, I create a solutions page manually. We have a pool of test data group that we work with of beta testers, alpha testers that we look to work on the solutions to have a industry wide perspective of what's successful. So we do not take any data from individual users. We are taking that from the test group and developing the solutions through the programs that I've written. Is there any other questions? I know I had a user that was, I believe, in Canada mentioning about seeing some of the profiles and finding them that they wanted a little bit more development, or that they were noticing that there was a little bit of, tendencies for maybe some grassy characters. I would say best way to address that if you see it is use the advanced styling. I definitely think there's a video online about optimizing your roast profile, which is super unique. The other one would be to adjust the DTR percent. Maybe you want slightly more or less. We adapt, generally speaking, when we're doing the best of Panama profiles, that for some of them we would go lower, some of them we would go higher, depending on the tendencies that we want. The other option is using the manual profile selector in order to pick a roast plan that's more suitable to maybe the style that you're looking for. For example, changing from the D profile to the B, like I do with Brazils, you might find that a great transition in order to bring up the qualities that you want. And then third would be taking one of those base plans that's closer to your taste and adjusting the profile points to give you a more balance to what you're looking for.
Awesome. Another question is, have there been any trends within varieties, or is it mainly just density?
Yeah, so I would say there's trends in varieties. The biggest one that I see in geisha is, generally speaking, you'll notice the geishas will crack on earlier power curves when you then put it against other coffees. But the issue that I saw that's specific to certain countries, where a geisha from Colombia to a geisha from uh, Panama has slightly different tendencies, and this is why we are evolving the version 5 to have country and variety working together in order to make sure that the solutions are factoring in all variables and not just one. Another thing that you'll notice is, generally speaking, some of the Ethiopians need a higher power curve because of the dense concentration of an heirloom. This is why we developed the heirloom cupping setting, which you can access in the Link app in order to turn that on and have a recommended development percent and sometimes power curve adjustment specifically for that particular variety, because it doesn't, necessarily work for all of the other Arabicas. So there's a few that we notice. I think the biggest one for me is not so much the variety tendency, but the combination of variety and country. I already know that this is why we give a window of first crack saying, 15 seconds before and after, even though most of the time it lands around 5 seconds, you know, within that range, is that even some Guatemalans, higher altitude wayways, will crack 10 seconds later than the suggested. But what we are doing is taking all of that data and tendency pattern, putting it into the new version that we're writing at the moment.
Awesome. The next question is there any way to access Marv or slash the virtual assistant online as well,
Yep. Yeah.
besides just the app?
Yeah, so you can jump onto the Nucleus Coffee Tools website and you can jump into Virtual Assistant and you'll be able to talk to Marv. Again, we also have one called Susie if you want to jump in and have a chat on any of our other handhold tools. They're designed to be there for you and have the team member of Nucleus brain coded into their decision making and answers. They also have a sassy amount of humor, which is great if you want to interact with them.
Awesome. Another question we have is, have you noticed any correlations in different decaffeination methods and how it affects coffee reacting to roasting?
Yeah. So we did custom and we actually, when I was in Canada, I think last year for the champions, we did a bit of work with Swiss Water on understanding decaf. That actually prompted us to write custom decaf um, profile suggestions with how we see them working. I'd find it's not so much on the way in which it's decaffeinated, but my answer would be it's more on the humidity that it's finished at once it's gone through the process, which is why I have been looking at that variable in order to make sure we can understand it. What I generally notice is depending on the finish rate of humidity can dictate a earlier or later first crack point away from the power curve that's suggested. So not so much on the way in which it's decapped, but more on the finishing when it's re-dried or however it's gone through the process. The humidity finishing is where is the big impact.
So we got another question from Andrew. He said, I've noticed that older stock coffee has grassier characteristics when the falling profiles like the other Canadian user mentioned. However, when I roast fresh greens, the profiles are on point. Is it possibly because of green moisture
Yeah,
percentage or what is it?
I think that what you'll generally see with older coffees is older coffees or more fermented coffees have a lower average development, volume by weight density. My suggestion to you would be for older stock coffees, selecting one of the profile plans that has a higher development percentage. So a higher amount of heat applied throughout the start. So for example, if you're using that same coffee for an older stock and then newer stock, I'd be roasting the older one on the B plan, and the newer stuff on the D plan. It's about, pushing that because it does have most likely a lower percentage left in the humidity that you want to force a faster roast, earlier crack, but make sure in order to mitigate the earthy or you know attributes which are more aged that you're doing a significant development percent. So I would say the best one for if something's older, it tastes like that, potentially have a look at changing your um, profile plan. Other option would be using the same profile plan that you're using, but increasing the development percent up 0.5 to 1%.
Awesome. Another question we have is when the coffee is cracking outside of the allocated window that the profile sits in, what's the easiest way to get to that new profile to get it
Yeah,
right within the sweet spot?
using the advanced styling. I can pull that up so you can just give a quick example if you haven't used it. Um, so let me just do a quick share for you guys to see. So you should all now see a version of the link app, hopefully. Um, what
No,
we what
I'm
we
not
would
seeing it, unfortunately.
let me maybe I didn't share it properly. Give me 1 second. Um, we can see it now.
Perfect.
Perfect. So you'd go into this setting, you'd go into advanced styling. We would select which of the profile plans which is categorized out. So let's say we were roasting on filter C, then implement the cracking time. So let's say this one cracked at 620 and the recommended profile power curve was 208. If we put that through the system, it's going to reprocess and like, in order to get this back on the box, go to profile 208 and a half for that setting. There's a great video on the Nucleus Coffee Tools training website that's called Optimizing Your Roast in 3 Steps. And it runs through the complete process of how to get to the perfect roast power curve and plan, as well as development percent for your coffee. Thoroughly recommend watching that video.
Awesome. While you have the link app on, uh, there's another question that just came in. Is there any preference settings that we can use to roast more consistently?
Yeah. So I would say that the big one for me is 100% if you're only roasting Arabica coffee, that you are turning on these two. If you don't know what these are, there's an info tab and it will give you a little bit of understanding on what they are. But I do find that advanced Arabica factoring in screen size is super important, and roast details having in the factoring of batch size is also a really important setup that you should have. Uh, if you're roasting for cupping heirloom varieties a lot, we do have a setting that will give a custom development percent recommendation that's more suitable for heirloom coffees. If we jump back into this system, and you'll see that I've set it up for um, all samples, is that it also asks us that we do have a catalog of non-Arabica coffees that we've done an extensive database on. This allows you to get more familiar with best ways to roast those coffees. Outside. So I would definitely say most people that you'll be running these sorry, these settings. And that's the best starting point. We will be adding a few more coming up that will give more options of precisions. Other things that I would recommend is going in and watching a video on Marv, I think Addis 4.1, that talks about the preference menu. When you access the roaster itself, there's a preference menu that you can turn on and off more or less features. Not all of the features are always turned on because it's designed to come in a very simple setting. I would go in there, watch the video of what's recommended, watch some of the understandings of what they do, and turn on and adjust them to your needs. If someone is always manually logging first crack, this is where I would change from time as the relative trigger point to first crack. Other ones is turning on always ask for fan adjust, and the last is always asking for DTR percent.
Amazing. Is there any other questions that we have before we wrap things up here?
Mate, the curls are the vibe. I'm just trying to look like a creative. What can I say? Just channeling my energy. Like this is where you get in the focus of looking to do more creative stuff. I'm just trying to challenge what I can think of. Awesome team. Well, I just want to say thanks for everyone for attending. Hopefully, the session was insightful, gave you a little bit of insight into the system. I know there's a lot to unpack and cover, but we did record the base session of it. So it'll give you guys a good understanding if you want to go back and go through some of the attributes. I'll also be providing some of these slides to the 8-ounce team and some other distributors of the link so that if you want to go to a more extensive study through some of the information you can. You can go to Nucleus Coffee Tools training YouTube to watch the videos, or the Nucleus Coffee Tools website, and see all of this information that I've also presented in this slide accessible to you with a bit more information and details. But thank you so much, guys, and we wish you a great uh, afternoon, evening, or morning, and also weekend wherever you are in the world. Cheers.
Bye-bye, everyone.